All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us of our first Presidential Primary Sources Project presentation of our 2023 season. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from our experts at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. And the title of our program today is A New Birth of Freedom, Examining Lincoln's Views on Democracy and Slavery. My name is Therese Borowski. I'm going to be your moderator today. So I'm here to just kind of help everything go smoothly. So if you need anything, go ahead and use the chat to get in touch with me, and I'll try to make sure everything is working the way it's supposed to be. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a collaboration between Internet2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. And we work together to bring these programs to you every year from January to April. This is just a quick disclaimer. By participating today, you are agreeing to be recorded and archived as well as streamed. We do keep recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel so that teachers and students can access them later on. All right, a few notes about participating today. So we want you to be able to participate as much as possible. That makes it a lot more fun for everyone. First and foremost, make sure you know where the chat box is. If you haven't found it, it should look like a little caption bubble. Go ahead and click on that. We will use that to ask and answer questions. Before we get started, if you want to introduce yourselves, you want to tell us where you are, what grade you're in, that would be great. We'd love to hear who we have today. So you can use the chat. You can also participate via video. If you want to be on video, again, drop a note in the chat and I will work on promoting you. You can also use audio. So if you want to use kind of the raise hand function, we'll use that to call on you and help you unmute. And then just overall, please just be respectful of our tools to participate. We want to make sure we're using them specifically to ask and answer questions about our presentation today. All right, and then just one more quick thank you from me. We're really excited to have you. If you enjoy the program today, this is our website. You're welcome to register for future programs. We'd love to see you again. All right, with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand it over to our presenters.
Good morning. My name is Heather Nice. I am the Director of Education at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum. Do any of you know where we're located? Any guesses? Okay, I see a hand in Edgewood. What do you think? Oh, you need to unmute.
The red mic is.
Okay, what do you think?
Washington, D.C.
We are not in Washington, D.C., but that's a really good guess because President Lincoln definitely spent some time there. Does anybody know where Lincoln lived before he went to the White House? I see another hand in the corner.
Springfield, Illinois.
Absolutely right. That is where we are located. You can see it behind Christian, not me anymore. I used to have those windows, but not anymore. So I'm going to be here to help moderate. I'm going to ask questions in the chat box, so feel free to chat with me. Dr. Christian McWhorter, who I'm going to let tell you a little bit more about himself, is our Lincoln historian, and he is going to tell you all about Lincoln. So I'm going to turn off my mic, but I'm here in the chat, and Christian, take it away.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, Heather is going to be here to help me today. So thanks to Heather and Therese both for chipping in and what, I wish I was with all of you in person. But that, I also love that we're getting people from all over the place. So one of the things that I'd like for this program is if you have questions or if you have comments or whatever, yeah, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat, to raise your hand. Hopefully this can be, kind of a back and forth and I can go in whatever direction you'd like to go. Like Heather said, my name is Christian. I'm the Lincoln historian here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum. And my job is to talk to folks like you and folks from all over the country and the world about Abraham Lincoln. And so with this project, right, this project's all about primary sources. So first of all, as I'm sure you all know, a primary source is a document that comes from the historical time that we're talking about. And in this case, I've got 3 documents written by Lincoln himself that I'm going to kind of introduce to you, and we'll read, and then it's just to get you thinking about, you know, one issue in particular, which is how you know, Lincoln himself, right, is thinking about issues of slavery and democracy. And we've got these 3 documents find Lincoln at different kind of key points in his professional life and key points in the history of the country. And I should say at the outset, right, for that slavery, right, so that the institution of slavery in America, where people are legally, you know, enslaving African Americans, forcing them to work for them, that was the major political issue of Lincoln's time. And it was the major issue that leads to the Civil War. And Lincoln is president during the Civil War. And so throughout Lincoln's political life, that's the issue he's dealing with, is slavery. And he's constantly thinking about it and trying to figure out, you know, what Lincoln is trying to figure. We now take for granted the idea that slavery is wrong and that slavery is in conflict with what America stands for. But Lincoln, in his time, not everybody believed that. And so Lincoln is wrestling with these ideas, right? What does slavery mean in a democracy? Can slavery exist in a democracy? And then furthermore, and hopefully we can get here by the end of the discussion, what role do African Americans themselves play in the future America? Again, we take for granted today that people of color, you know, have the same rights as everybody else and these kind of things. In Lincoln's time, that was absolutely not a thing that everybody agreed on. And so Lincoln is also going to have to start thinking about that. Once there is no slavery in America, what does America look like without slavery? All right, so we're going to try to span all those things today, but we'll see how far we get. So I want to introduce then the first document is the shortest one, and I think it gets right to the heart of this question. One of the things that's great about Abraham Lincoln, again, today we take for granted things like that we write things on social media, we make videos of ourselves, you know, we can do all these things where our thoughts are recorded. Well, back in the 19th century, all they could do was mostly just write things down on paper, right? And so Lincoln, we're fortunate with Lincoln that one of the things Lincoln did was he wrote a lot of notes to himself. So sometimes when Lincoln would be trying to think through something, he would get out a piece of paper and he would write ideas down and they would shove them in a shelf. And that was how he worked through some of his ideas. And so the first document that we're going to show today is one of those notes, and it's here in our collection. It's actually held in this library. We don't actually know when he wrote it. I think it's kind of dated August 1st, 1858, but we don't really know that. We think he wrote it in the 1850s for various reasons. And in the 1850s, that's before the Civil War starts, right? The Civil War starts in 1861. So in the 1850s, Lincoln is a politician. He's part of a new party, the Republican Party, which is one of the main goals of the Republican Party is to stop the spread of slavery from the southern states where it exists. And Lincoln is campaigning. One of the things he does during that period is he tries to get into the Senate. He tries to get elected to the U.S. Senate, which he loses to Stephen Douglas. Some of you probably heard of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. That's what all that was about. So he's trying to sort through his ideas for what he stands for as a politician. So Heather, go ahead and put it up then. Yeah, this is that note. So Lincoln writes this note to himself, probably in the mid to late 1850s. And I'll read it to you. So as I read it, I want you to think about, so this is Lincoln thinking about democracy and he's thinking about slavery. And I want you to think about what you think Lincoln means here, and what it says about kind of Lincoln's time. All right. So Lincoln writes, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the differences, is no democracy." What do you think Lincoln is trying to say here? What do you think Lincoln is grappling with in this document? Anybody have any ideas? Lincoln is, here, yeah, feel free to use the chat box or raise your hand, right? So Lincoln Lincoln is notice he's underlined things as well, right? That underlining. Oh, there we go. I think we have someone. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Edgewood.
Equal rights.
Equal rights. Which right in particular? Where's Lincoln seeing equality in this document? When Lincoln says he would not be a slave, he also would not be a master, right? What kind of basic inequality is Lincoln getting at, right? What he's saying is, if you don't want to be a slave, right? If you don't want to be enslaved, if you don't want to be owned by somebody else and receive no compensation for your work, right? Right, and that's exactly. I see the comment there. There's no difference between slave and master, right? What Lincoln is saying is if you don't want to be a slave, right? If you think that's a bad idea, then you don't want to be a master either, right? Because then you're benefiting from a system that you inherently know is unfair, right? That everyone knows, everyone recognizes, right? Lincoln, in another document, Lincoln says, because there's all these people in America at the time, right? Saying, no, slavery's a good thing, right? Slavery's a good thing. It helps the people who are enslaved. It helps the economy, right? And one of the things Lincoln says in another document, I'm going to paraphrase, but he says, you know, it's interesting. I get all these people who talk to me about how good slavery is, but none of them volunteer to be a slave themselves, right? Nobody wants to be a slave. They all understand, and you know, everybody knows that slavery is unfair, but they come up with these justifications. So they come up with these reasons to say it's a good thing. Exactly. I see another comment there. Democracy is not about owning others. So that's the next point, right? So Lincoln is seeing he won't be, you know, if you won't be a slave, then you have to not be a master too, right? Because that means you're participating in an unfair system. And so, if so, the first comment we got from you guys, right, was about equality. So that means this is an unequal situation. And in Lincoln's mind, democracy then is about equality, right? Or at least equality before the law, right? So if that's true, then that must be slavery must be anti-democratic, right? Now, again, I want to point out, not everyone agreed with this point of view back then, right? Some people were perfectly fine with only white people having the right to vote and white people being able to own people of color, right? Lots of people in Lincoln's time were okay with this idea and didn't see democracy as being, you know, against the institution of slavery, right? Lincoln is thinking on his own, right? And there are others who believe this too. He's not the only one, that these two things can't work together. And so you get to the end of this quote, right? Where he says, whatever differs from this to the extent of the difference is no democracy, right? So Lincoln is coming up with, he's kind of building his political stance in this document, right? That anything that he encounters that breaks this one truth that he's got, that like, if you won't be a slave, then you can't be a master, right? Therefore is anti-democratic, right? And really that's Lincoln does his best to stick to that throughout his political career, and then especially once he becomes president. So I'm going to move on to when he becomes president. Although if you have more questions come about this document, please don't hesitate to ask them or to send them my way. So Lincoln gets elected president in 1860.
Hey, Christian.
Sorry, yeah.
Really quickly, somebody did just comment, and not white people voting, but only white men, correct? Women didn't get the vote until the 1900s. Can you
Thank you for making that distinction. Absolutely. We are only talking about men, and that will be true throughout this discussion. Women do not get the right to vote for a long, long time. Lincoln, and we are going to talk a little bit, if we get there, about the right to vote at the end of this presentation, because Lincoln starts thinking about that. But Lincoln never... at least officially advocates for women to have the right to vote. There's like one statement he makes early in his career that some people say shows that he believed in women having the right to vote. Maybe, but he never officially tries to make it happen. So yes, to be very clear, we are only talking about equality for men and voting rights for men, those kind of things at that time, because women had not yet achieved the right to vote. They won't do that until the 20th century. So thank you, yes, for pointing that out. So although women, again, talking about slavery, that is not a distinction made based on gender. So we're going to talk in a second here about the Emancipation Proclamation. That doesn't matter whether you were a man or a woman. The Emancipation Proclamation applied to everybody. So So getting to that then, so Abraham Lincoln gets elected president in 1860. He becomes president in 1861, and he's the first Republican president. And so part of his platform, like I said earlier, is to prevent the spread of slavery from the southern states where it currently exists. All right. So to be clear, it's not part of his platform to get rid of slavery. Lincoln didn't believe he could legally do that as president, and a lot of other Republicans don't as well. That doesn't really matter to a lot of white Southerners. White Southerners see Lincoln's election and the Republican Party's control of the federal government as a direct threat to the institution of slavery. And so they decide at the end of 1860, so before Lincoln even takes office, they decide that they need to create their own country, that they need to break away from the United States and form their own country called the Confederate States of America. That's what they ended up calling it. That protects, that has in their constitution and a statement protecting the institution of slavery, because they're afraid that the Republicans in charge of the federal government will make slavery illegal. And all of them, eventually all but 4 slave states break away from the Union and join the Confederacy. And that's what leads to the Civil War. Lincoln believes that, and a lot of other people did too, that that's illegal, that you can't just break away from the United States and form your own country. And so that's what the Civil War, on paper, that's what the Civil War is initially about, is that the Southern states have illegally broken away. So they're rebels, right? That's why you often hear Southerners or Confederates referred to as rebels during the Civil War. That's defined as a rebellion, that they create their own country. And so a war breaks out to keep them in the United States.
Hey, Christian, can we pause for just a second and maybe ask if anybody knows who some of those states were?
Sure. Yeah. Can anybody name some of the states that were in the Confederacy? That's a good question.
You can use the chat or you can turn your mic on, either one.
South Carolina.
South Carolina's where it starts. That's the first one to secede. Good answer.
We have Mississippi and Tennessee in the chat box. Virginia.
Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Virginia. Go ahead.
Tennessee.
Edgewood.
Tennessee.
Tennessee.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you a couple other questions. Can anybody name what becomes the capital city of the Confederacy?
Ooh.
That's right. From Creek House School, Richmond, Virginia. All right, last question. Again, just to set your kind of geography. Can you name one or more of the 4 slave states that don't join the Confederacy?
Well, that's a stumper.
That's a hard one. Right? Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, one more. It's the one nobody ever gets.
Anybody think they know that one?
Delaware. Everyone always forgets Delaware. West Virginia is actually not a bad answer either. West Virginia becomes a state during the Civil War. But this is something to remember too. So Lincoln is president, but 4 states that have slavery legal don't join the Confederacy. So he has to remember that, right? So as the war goes on, Lincoln believes from the beginning, and so do a lot of people, that the war is about slavery, right? That the issue of slavery's expansion is why the war is happening. But the official reason for the war, and the official reason Lincoln, has called out for volunteers, right, to create what we call the Union Army, right, to fight the Confederacy, is just to keep them in the Union. But as the war goes on, it becomes obvious to Lincoln and to Congress and to the Army especially, a large part due to the actions of African Americans themselves, that if you're going to defeat the Confederacy and if you're going to keep this from happening again, the war needs to be a war against slavery, not just to restore the Union. And so the main way that Lincoln makes that happen is with the Emancipation Proclamation, which you've probably all heard of, right? So the Emancipation Proclamation is a presidential order that goes into effect on January 1st, 1863, that frees all enslaved people in states under rebellion. So all the rebel states, technically, all enslaved people in those states are free on January 1st, 1863. So that's a big move by Lincoln against the institution of slavery. So what's our next document then? So our next document is a document that people don't normally think of in this context of slavery and race, but it's the most famous Lincoln document there is, and that's the Gettysburg Address. So I'm going to read the Gettysburg Address to you. So I'll give you a little context for that too. So the Battle of Gettysburg, as probably a lot of you know, is the largest battle ever. It's the largest battle of the Civil War. It's also the largest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. About 160,000 people fight in that battle. About a third of them get killed or wounded or captured. So it's a horrible thing, right? It's a lot, because there's all these casualties. They build a national cemetery there.
Christian,
And
really quickly, before you keep going into Gettysburg, because you mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation, Lakewood Elementary wants to know how he can enforce them being free.
I also want to throw that back, because anybody think of how Lincoln can enforce the Emancipation Proclamation? It happens in the middle of a war, so how is he enforcing it? Because that's a good question. He actually doesn't have much control over the states, right? Because they're in rebellion. Right, the states are in rebellion. That someone just answered that. So then how is he going to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation?
Edgewood, go ahead.
You're muted, Edgewood. Okay.
He makes them fight for him.
Well, that's one that you're absolutely right. That's one of the things he does. Is the Emancipation Proclamation invites African Americans to join the Union Army or to join the U.S. Army and help fight. But how does he free? If he doesn't actually have control over the states in rebellion, how's he going to free anybody there? Do any of you know the story of Juneteenth? The story of Juneteenth is an example of what he does. He uses the army, right? The Union Army, right? All these, what he does, what the Emancipation Proclamation does is it empowers, the Union Army can, as it makes its way now through the South, as it takes back territory, it's going to free all the enslaved people it encounters, right? And that's what happens on Juneteenth, right? By June 1865, right? And Lincoln's not even alive by then, right? Lincoln's already been assassinated. So this is still happening even after Lincoln has died. The Union Army gets to Texas and frees the enslaved people there, right? That's what happens on Juneteenth. That's where that story comes from. That's the Emancipation Proclamation.
Christian, we also have a comment in the chat from Harry who says he doesn't actually free them, but recalls that it's just like insurance to get the slaves to help him take down the Confederacy, fighting from the inside.
I mean, that's part of it. That is absolutely part of the reason he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. He hopes it's going to create a revolt, that the enslaved people in the South will begin to resist. But they'll begin to fight for their freedom, which a lot of them do. A lot of them already were, by the way. So that way, all these Confederate armies that Lincoln's armies are fighting are going to have, back home, they're going to have problems because the enslaved people there are going to be fighting for their freedom. And some of that absolutely happens. And of course, the main way, as one of you mentioned, is a lot of them run away. A lot of enslaved people run away and join the Union Army and end up being one of the keys to the United States winning the Civil War, is the participation of Black soldiers, which has a real effect on a document we'll talk about later. To get back to Gettysburg, so Gettysburg happens after the Emancipation Proclamation, right? The Emancipation Proclamation happens in January. Gettysburg is fought from July 1st to 3rd. Of 1863. So there's no African Americans fight at the Battle of Gettysburg. Although there are African Americans in the Union Army at that time, none of them are at Gettysburg. But it's a huge battle. It's very costly, and so I'll answer that question too in a second, because that's a great question. So they end up building a cemetery at Gettysburg, and Lincoln is invited to give a dedication at the cemetery. So that's what the Gettysburg Address is. Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address on November 19th, 1863. But before I get to it, I want to answer that question that just got asked, because I think it's a key question, especially as we think about this document and then the last document we're going to talk about. The question was, why was the Union Army, or why was the United States Army still segregated, right, by race? Why were white soldiers and black soldiers were kept in different units, right? You couldn't be if you were in they called them regiments. That's what groups of soldiers were called then. There were white regiments and there were black regiments. They didn't mix. And the question is why? If they were against slavery, why were they still separated? Well, that's because, and this goes back to some of the stuff I talked about at the beginning, just because you're opposed to the institution of slavery doesn't necessarily mean that you believe in racial equality, right? It means you believe that nobody should be a slave, right? Like Lincoln says, right? That nobody should be a slave. You shouldn't benefit from that system. If you're a master, you shouldn't have slaves because you wouldn't have that role, right? But that doesn't mean you think that white and black people should have all the same rights, right? That's another idea. And that's an idea they're going to grapple with. And really, they're going to grapple with for the next 100 years. Like, this isn't just a Civil War thing, right? The Civil Rights Movement doesn't happen until the 1960s, 100 years later. So that's a much more complicated question, and one that it takes a long time for America to sort out. Some people would say America is still sorting out that question. So that's why they keep them segregated. Yes.
And actually, I was going to add on to that. If you remember when Martin Luther King, they did the March on Washington, it was actually in 1963 on the 100-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And that was on purpose.
Right. And segregation in all kinds of aspects of American life is still legal until the Civil Rights Movement. It's not until the 1960s that it becomes illegal. Any more questions? Why did Lincoln think it was okay to send former slaves to colonies in Africa? That's another question that I think we might get to a little bit in the last one, but remember I mentioned that earlier, which is the let's say mostly white people, the white people who are anti-slavery, who are in favor of emancipation, who are in favor of destroying slavery, they don't all agree on what America should look like after slavery. And some of them don't know, like they're still sorting out these ideas. And Lincoln is one of them. So I don't think Lincoln, there are certain speeches Lincoln gives and certain things Lincoln writes where Lincoln isn't sure that white and black people can live together. And one of the solutions that Lincoln comes up with and a lot of other people come up with is, well, then African Americans, once they're freed, the thing to do with them is don't keep them in America, send them back to Africa, because that's where they came from to begin with. Of course, most African Americans, now some African Americans want to do this, but most African Americans don't. They've been in America for generations at this point, right, in the 1860s. So it's definitely more of a white idea than a black idea, but that's why Lincoln is considering that, and a lot of other people do, because they're trying to figure out what America will look like after slavery. Again, we take these things for granted now, because we've been living in a country without slavery for over 150 years, but they didn't know that yet, and they're having to sort these ideas out. Any other questions before I get, Heather, you were going to say something.
I'm just going to add to that. So one of the things we talk about a lot is how Lincoln was both and. So he was both someone who thought slavery was wrong and worked to end it, and someone who wasn't sure he wanted Black citizens to be equal to white citizens, right? So you can be both of those things. And so I think it's important. A lot of times you hear people talk about historical characters, historical figures, and they pick one or the other, but really it's a both and situation. He was both of those things.
That's a great point to make. And it's one of the things I hope you learn from what we're talking about today. And I'm just trying to introduce some ideas to like get you thinking, right? Is Lincoln wasn't perfect, right? Lincoln is the most famous and probably most revered American, but Lincoln himself didn't really know where he stood on these things his whole life. And Lincoln's opinion on this, on slavery and race and all kinds of things, changed over time. One of the things that I kind of admire most about Lincoln, that I've learned from working here, especially in dealing with Lincoln every day, is how Lincoln was always willing to learn new things and change his opinion on things and evolve as a human being. And one of the things that we're trying to kind of show by having these 3 documents over, about a decade of Lincoln's life is the way Lincoln's own views changed over time, his views on slavery and his views on race. I'm not going to say that by the time Lincoln died, he believed in total racial equality. That's something people argue about, but you can see a change. That experience, that meeting African Americans and things like this, these helped Lincoln. Absolutely. Well, someone just asked for Frederick Douglass. That's one of those relationships I just talked about, right? When Lincoln knew African American people here in Springfield, But when he gets to Washington, he meets a lot more. And there's already a community of like free African-American people in Washington that kind of that get to know Lincoln. A lot of them work in the White House. Frederick Douglass seeks out Lincoln. He has a number. For those of you who don't know, Frederick Douglass is probably the most prominent in his day, and probably still today, the most prominent Black anti-slavery advocate or abolitionist, which means just someone who's really opposed to slavery. And so Frederick Douglass seeks out Lincoln and has meetings with him, and Lincoln gets to know him. And so all these things probably work on Lincoln to change Lincoln's views on racial equality. No, nobody at the White House. I just got a question, were the staff of the White House enslaved? No, they had been. They're certainly under previous presidents, there were enslaved people at the White House. When Lincoln is there, nobody who works in the White House is enslaved. And actually, it's during Lincoln's presidency that slavery becomes illegal in the District of Columbia. So when he gets to Washington, there are still enslaved people there. But one of the things Lincoln has the power to do, right, because the District of Columbia isn't a state, right? It's technically not a state. It's run by Congress, technically. So Congress is able to make slavery illegal in the District of Columbia much more easily than it does elsewhere. And so slavery becomes illegal in the District of Columbia while Lincoln is there. But the staff of the White House, they're mostly Black, but they are free Black people, and Lincoln gets to know them, and they influence Lincoln.
Hey, Christian, can I recommend we move on to Gettysburg, and I'll keep track of the questions that come in so we don't miss any. We will get to your questions. I just want to make sure we don't miss all 3 documents.
Yeah, and when we should try to get, well, and Gettysburg is a little longer, so I'll read about Gettysburg. So I'm going to read you the Gettysburg Address. One disclaimer I'll put out ahead of time that is kind of a fun fact about the Gettysburg Address is we don't actually know exactly what Lincoln said on November 19th, 1863. There are 5 copies of the Gettysburg Address that have survived in Lincoln's own hand. And we don't know which one, if any of them, he read from that day. One of them is here in this collection. We know he wrote this one after. He wrote it for somebody else. I don't have time to tell the story. Although I will say the way we got it is school kids donated money to the state of Illinois, and that's how during World War II, and that's how the state of Illinois was able to buy it. So that's the copy I'm going to read from today. It's the copy that we have, but they all have little differences, believe it or not. And so generally they're all the same, but there are little differences. So this is our copy. It's called the Everett copy. I'm going to read you the whole thing, but I want you to think about it in terms of the stuff we've been talking about: slavery, race, and equality, right? Most of this speech is about soldiers and their sacrifice in the battle, but think about these other issues and maybe some of the things Lincoln's trying to say here. Because remember, this is after the Emancipation Proclamation. I want to remind you again, this is after the Emancipation Proclamation has gone into effect. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So that's Lincoln's most famous speech. Right away, I see Edgewood coming in. All men are created equal. Exactly. In Lincoln's mind, one of the things Lincoln argues for way back in the 1850s with that first document we're talking about is Lincoln makes the point that the Declaration of Independence, right? That's where that statement comes from, right? All men are created equal. But the Declaration of Independence does not make a distinction based on race. And so Lincoln argues from early in his career that the Declaration of Independence is an anti-slavery document because it doesn't distinguish based on race. It says all men are created equal. Remember, we already talked about women. Unfortunately, that's a different story, but absolutely, that's one thing that he draws out in that speech. Any other reactions to things Lincoln says in that speech? If you look at the end of the, last line, by the people, for the people. Right. So by the people, of the people, for the people. Again, that issue of equality, right? Lincoln, now notice Lincoln never actually references African Americans in this speech at all, right? He never actually talks about slavery, but all these ideas, right, are emphasizing that idea of equality, right? There's one other phrase he used near the end. Did anybody catch it? Where he's talking about the future. He's saying what he thinks these soldiers are fighting for. Did anybody catch it? What does he think the soldiers at Gettysburg were fighting for? And he obviously means the Union. He doesn't mean the Confederacy. Did anybody catch that? He talks about, what's that, Heather?
I was to say, what does he say? He says a new birth of what? What is he looking for?
A new birth of what? Freedom, exactly, right? That word freedom, right? One of the things that you can, and again, people argue, by the way, I shouldn't say that there's one way to read this speech. People have been arguing for 150 years about what Lincoln is actually saying in this speech. But one way to read this speech is that what Lincoln is saying is, up until now, right, America has not lived up to this idea of freedom that it introduced in the Declaration of Independence, right? But we're going to create, through this war, we're going to create a new birth of freedom, right? Where we're going to redefine what freedom means, which in Lincoln's mind is what he thinks it always meant. Where, what does that mean? It means an America without slavery, right? It at least means that. He might be going even further than that. We don't know. But it at least means an America without slavery. That's a new birth of freedom. That's what Lincoln thinks the soldiers at Gettysburg died for. Did Lincoln own slaves? I'm going to go ahead and answer that right now. That is a common myth about Abraham Lincoln, that Abraham Lincoln owned slaves. Lincoln never owned slaves. He did have some African Americans who worked for him at his home here in Springfield, and I already talked about the African Americans who worked at the White House. But Lincoln never actually owned enslaved people himself. But Mary did. Now, Mary didn't own enslaved people, but Mary grew up in a slaveholding family. That's Lincoln's wife, right? Mary Lincoln. Mary Lincoln grew up in Kentucky, and her father was a slaveholder. So Mary grew up around enslaved people, and most of Mary's parenting came from an enslaved woman. And then Lincoln was born in Kentucky, right? Lincoln was born in Kentucky. He grew up in Indiana, and then he ends up here in Illinois. So Lincoln was born in a slave state too, and would have encountered enslaved people as a young man. But he never owned any enslaved people himself, nor did his parents. Heather, we got anything else before?
You did get a quick question about Gettysburg that I think is important. You mentioned the 5 versions of the address.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody wanted to know if the differences are big, same idea, different vocabulary. So if you could just speak for a second to the differences, I think that's important.
Most of them are the same. Almost the entire speech is the same in most of them. He just changes a word here and there. So some of it is just Lincoln is editing himself, right? He's a writer. The biggest difference between them all actually comes at the end. When I said, oh, hang on, I've moved it here. The very end of it, where he says that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. The under God part is actually missing from the first 2 versions he writes. And then the last 3 versions have it, right? So ours is the first then. that includes under God. And so there's been a debate historians argue whether Lincoln actually said under God when he first gave the speech, or whether he adds it later, like, oh, that sounds good, and then he adds it later. We don't really know, unfortunately. So yes, we know exactly which ones he wrote in which order, all 5 of them. So there's 5 of them. He writes them all. The first 2 are a little obscure. One of the first 2 might be actually a draft that he wrote before he delivered the speech, but we know which order they came in. We don't know the specific date for all of them. So, all right, we're at our 20-minute warning. Any other questions, Heather, I should answer before I move on to our last document?
There are not.
All right, so the last document is the last speech Lincoln ever gives, right? So Lincoln, as I mentioned earlier, Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on April 14th, 1865. He dies the next day, the next morning. The Civil War at that time is, it really takes the whole rest of the year for the Civil War to end, but the Confederacy is falling apart in early April of 1865. So Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, if you know who he is, right, the main Confederate general, he's surrendered by then. Richmond, we talked about the capital of Confederacy being at Richmond. It has been captured by the United States by then. So the Union is winning. It's very clear the Union is going to win when Lincoln is assassinated. But Lincoln isn't really going to live then to see, to impose what he envisioned, right? Remember, so I've been talking this whole time about how everyone has different ideas about what America is going to look like after slavery, right? Lincoln has ideas about that, but he never really gets to do them because he's assassinated. And he doesn't talk about them a lot either. So we don't really know a lot about what Lincoln's vision for the future of America was. One big thing we do know, though, which is not part of this speech that I'm going to talk about, is I already talked about the Emancipation Proclamation, but remember I said the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the states that were rebelling. Can anybody tell me what actually destroys slavery in America? What is it that makes slavery permanently illegal in America? Does anybody know? Well, Heather knows. That's right. Well, actually, both those answers are right. I saw the 13th Amendment and the end of the Civil War. Both those things are right. You need to win the Civil War before the 13th Amendment can go into effect. But they ultimately pass a constitutional amendment that makes it illegal to enslave people in the United States. And that's the 13th Amendment. And it becomes a condition for the Confederate states to get readmitted to the Union after the Civil War. Is one of the things they have to do is ratify the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment, but it doesn't get ratified, right? It doesn't become part of the Constitution until December of 1865. So when Lincoln dies, it's made its way through Congress. But then all the states, right? The states have to ratify it. And that's still underway when Lincoln dies. So Lincoln actually never lives to see the institution of slavery completely eliminated in America, but it's underway when he gets assassinated. So this speech, Lincoln goes to visit Richmond after it falls in early April. And then he comes back and he gives this speech on April 11th, 1865. I just told you Lincoln gets assassinated on April 14th. So Lincoln doesn't know that this is going to be his last speech. But fortunately for us, he talks about some of his ideas for what he thinks the nation will look like after the Civil War in this speech. Specifically, he talks about Louisiana. So Louisiana at this time has been, especially New Orleans, has been, the United States has reclaimed most of Louisiana from the Confederacy by this time. It has actually been in control of Louisiana for a while. So a new loyal government has been elected in Louisiana, and they're kind of experimenting, right? Because Louisiana was a slave state. So they're kind of experimenting throughout the Civil War with what Louisiana can look like without slavery. And so there's a couple times where Lincoln gives his opinion on that process. All right. And that's what he's talking about here. So this is a really long speech. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I think all I'm going to read is the first paragraph we've given you, because we only have about 15 minutes left, and I still want time to answer some questions if you have them. So this is Lincoln giving a talk. We don't own this document, by the way. Fun fact about this document is missing. Nobody knows where this document is, right? One of the, all the presidents now, after they leave office, right, they have presidential libraries, and the National Archive system is where all their papers go. When Lincoln was president, that didn't happen. So this copy of his speech, and he gives the speech from the window of the White House, and his son, Tad, is sitting on the floor next to him. And so every time Lincoln reads the page, he drops it on the floor, and Tad picks it up. So we know the whole story of how he reads this speech, but we don't actually know where this speech is. Somebody owns it. Some private citizen out there owns it. It isn't owned by an institution, but we actually don't know where. People have theories, but nobody actually knows where this document is. But this is a copy of it. This is what you're seeing is a photocopy of it in Lincoln's writing. So Heather, we'll jump to the paragraph that, it is also unsatisfactory, the one where he talks about voting rights. No, you passed it. That some 12,000 is right after it, I think, right? I'll say if we can't find it quick, I'll just read it now. Here it is, the very intelligent. So, yeah, there you go. It is also, Heather just highlight where we're going to start. We're going to read from there to the end of that paragraph. Well, I don't know if we got all the way to the end of the paragraph, but we'll read the first portion. Lincoln says, okay, he's talking about Louisiana. He says, it is also unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is just a fancy way to say the vote, all right? Voting rights. That the elective franchise is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. Still, the question is not whether the Louisiana government as it stands is quite all that is desirable. The question is, will it be wiser to take it as it is and help to improve it, or to reject and disperse it? Think about the first part of what I said. What is Lincoln pushing for here? What is Lincoln recommending the government of Louisiana do? Using outdated language, the colored man, we don't use that language anymore. But who is Lincoln talking about, and what is he recommending Louisiana do? I see we got one at Edgewood. We have one answer. Here we go. Oh.
He's recommending that they allow people of color to vote.
Right. He is recommending that all people should be involved in government. What the answer was, that people be allowed to vote. Right. He's recommending that African-American, well, let's back off. Who exactly is he recommending should have the right to vote? He's not necessarily saying all people. He's not even necessarily saying all African-Americans. What is he saying?
I think like for African-American men.
He's not even necessarily saying, he's putting a little bit of a, so you're right. He's saying all African-American men might get the right to vote, but he's even backing off a little bit. He says, yeah, he makes a couple of exceptions.
All African men of Louisiana.
You're getting close. Yes, he's talking specifically about Louisiana.
What does he say? I'm going to screen share the text version really quick so you don't have to read Lincoln's handwriting. Give me one second.
Lincoln's handwriting can be rough.
And I will get it up there.
Yeah, and even highlight, if you can, the part where he's... So, but highlight where he said, from now conferred to soldiers. Okay, so here, right, he's hedging a little bit, right? What Lincoln is saying is, he's saying that the vote, could be given to, again, the colored man, which he means African American men, right? But he's hedging a little. He's saying, or maybe just the very intelligent or those who served as soldiers. So this is important because it ties back to where we started, right? Lincoln has come a long way, and America has come a long way. White America has come a long way since the 1850s, where now you have a sitting president for the first time ever. No president before Lincoln, well in office, had ever advocated for Black people to have the right to vote. So now you have the president is advocating for Black people to have the right to vote, but he's saying maybe only just the most intelligent or those who fought as soldiers, right? So he's not necessarily, even before he dies, right? Lincoln isn't necessarily even yet advocating for all African American men to have the right to vote. So what he's doing is both really progressive, right? He's really far ahead of people, right? He's pushing for a fundamental American right to be equal, right? That everyone should have the right to vote, but he's also willing to go, well, maybe not all African American men. So again, the question, like I said, is that Lincoln is progressing, right? Lincoln's views, he's learning as he goes, but we don't know where Lincoln would have eventually landed. And unfortunately, he gets assassinated, and this is the last statement we have from him.
Hey, Christian, we have a great question in the audience I want to promote. Stephen asked if the speech about Black voting rights and citizenship helped John Wilkes Booth decide to kill Lincoln.
Absolutely, it did. Yeah. So that seems like almost such a leading question. I feel like you know what happened. So John Wilkes Booth, I mean, I'll be real quick because we're short on time. John Wilkes Booth is a famous actor in America, part of a famous acting family. And think of him like a Hemsworth brother. And although they're Australian, but you know what I mean. And he absolutely believes in slavery and white supremacy, and believes that Black people should not be equal. And he supports the Confederacy throughout the Civil War. And he comes up with this scheme during the Civil War, way long before this speech, that he's going to kidnap Abraham Lincoln, and he's going to basically keep him hostage and exchange him for Confederate independence, right? That's his plan. And again, we don't know these things for sure, like, because different people, John Wilkes Booth also doesn't survive much longer after he assassinates Abraham Lincoln because he gets killed. But this is what we think and what people around him have told us. When Lincoln comes back to Washington in April of 1865, Booth goes to this speech, and Booth hears Lincoln say this about giving some African American men the right to vote. And Booth turns to the person next to him, and I'm going to paraphrase because Booth uses horrible racist language to say this, but Booth basically says, that means African Americans will be citizens. Now I have to kill him. And so the story is that it's that night that Booth changes his mind from kidnapping Lincoln to murdering Lincoln. And that's, of course, what he'll do 3 days later. So Booth murders Lincoln because he can't imagine an America where Black and white people are equal. And it shows how far Lincoln has come too, that this idea of giving African Americans the right to vote is so radical that, again, we don't think of it as a radical idea now. We take it for granted, but it's so radical to some white people that a white person shoots him for it's almost specifically that idea and murders him. Any other questions before I? So like I said, we don't really know how far Lincoln would come with this idea. There are other documents where Lincoln is advocating for African Americans to have the right to vote. What we know is we know the period after the Civil War is a very kind of confusing period, right? We call it Reconstruction, right? It's a very confusing period. African Americans make a lot of gains, but there's a lot of setbacks then afterwards. But one of the gains that African Americans do make is there is a constitutional amendment passed that gives African American men the right to vote. Efforts are then made after that to prevent them from doing that, but it does become a constitutional right that African American men can vote. And so, you can see a line from this speech of Lincoln's to that being put in effect. But again, Lincoln never lives to see that and never lives to see even the 13th Amendment get passed that makes slavery illegal. So that's, I think, just to wrap up, I hope you got then an impression of, Lincoln's own views on these things and how events shaped Lincoln. And actually, let me draw out one more thing that Lincoln advocates in this speech, that one of the things Lincoln specifically points out in this speech is that he wants to give African-American soldiers the right to vote, right? I mentioned earlier, we talked a little bit about Frederick Douglass and the staff of the White House, that African-Americans themselves are doing things that are changing Lincoln's views, right, on equality and slavery and these things. One of the things that really impacts Lincoln and impacts a lot of other people is what one of you mentioned earlier, that African-American men fight in the United States Army to defeat the Confederacy in the Civil War, and that they fight really well, right? That they're very brave, that they make a lot of sacrifices. And that's why I think it's very significant that by April 1865, Lincoln is imagining we have to give these people the right to vote, right? They fought so well for their own freedom and to preserve the country. They need to be, at least the soldiers need to be given the right to vote. So that shows one of the ways Lincoln is learning, right? That seeing how African Americans fight for the Union changes Lincoln's mind maybe on racial equality.
So, quick question I promised we would get back to. What about Harriet Tubman? Did Lincoln ever meet her?
Lincoln did not meet Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman helps the United States Army fight in the Civil War. She goes down, she makes raids into the Confederacy. She helps recruit African-American soldiers. The other kind of most prominent woman abolitionist is Sojourner Truth. Lincoln does meet Sojourner Truth at the White House. And she also helps recruit Black soldiers and helps defeat the Confederacy. But we don't believe Lincoln ever met Harriet Tubman.
So we got a question, which I've heard you answer before, but I think it's good to make the distinction. Edgewood would like to know if Booth was acting in the show that Lincoln was watching. And just as an FYI, we also have an on-camera question. So if you want to answer that, and then we can go to that, and that can be our last one.
Sure. Booth was not performing in the play. Lincoln was seeing a comedy that night called Our American Cousin. And Booth was not in that play. That's why he's able to sneak in, right? He's able to sneak into the theater and come in behind Lincoln, and he shoots him in the back of the head. He's not in that play, but Lincoln had seen plays that Booth was in. So one of the kind of, weird things about the Lincoln assassination, right? Lincoln never gets the chance to turn around and see who's shooting him, right? Because Booth shoots him in the back of the head before he can. But if Lincoln had, he would have recognized John Wilkes Booth. Booth was very famous. And Lincoln had seen him before in Washington, I think even in Ford's Theater, the theater he's in that night. So he would have recognized Booth had he seen him before he was shot. Was it Edgewood we're going to next? Was that, yeah.
So was there any law about African Americans running for president?
That's a good question. I think based on, once the other amendment, Reconstruction Amendment that I didn't talk about is the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment basically guarantees that all of the rights in the Constitution, particularly in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, apply to all Americans equally. That's basically what the 14th Amendment says. So I would say, I don't think anything like directly answers what you're saying, but basically once the 14th Amendment goes into effect, I think, yes, technically an African-American man at that time could have run for president.
And I typed something in the chat. I'm going to finish really fast. Edgewood, you asked, somebody asked if Lincoln would have run for president if he had survived. He actually had just run for president and done his second inaugural the month before he was assassinated.
Yes, Lincoln ran for re-election during the Civil War, got re-elected, and in March had begun his second term. So that's one of the things why I say we don't know what Lincoln would have done. Lincoln had, in April, when he was assassinated, Lincoln had more than 3 years of his presidency still in front of him, where he still would have been president, but we don't know what he would have done with those 3 years. We can only guess based on speeches like the one I read to you, because we never get to see what Lincoln's second term would have looked like.
All right, Christian, we need to cut it off or they're never going to let us come back.
right.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. We have another
you.
session in March, so we'd love to see you there.